All right, let's start the show. Welcome back, everyone, to Research with Relevance Friday Features. I hope you all had a wonderful first week of classes. We are excited to see people on campus again, to see the students and the staff and the faculty, socially distanced, of course. And we're just really thrilled that to bring this show back to you. I think we just had a great success in the spring with trying to keep this show going, to keep us connected to each other as researchers and scholars. And so we're excited to bring that back to you this fall. We don't know what the fall is going to look like from this point forward. We're going to take it week by week, but no matter what happens, this show is going to continue. So instead of having a show every Friday at 4 p.m., we're going to have a show every other Friday at 4 p.m. And we'll be talking to you at the very end of today's show to tell you what's coming up in 2 weeks. My name is Phaedra Corso, and I'm the Vice President for Research here at KSU. And this is the Research with Relevance show. And we're going to do the same format that we did in the spring. So just to remind you of some housekeeping notes. First, please make sure that your mics are all muted until we open it up for questions in the end. Second, if you want to be able to focus on a particular speaker, and we have two today, you're going to search for their names under the little people icon on Teams, and there's going to be 3 dots, and if you click on those 3 dots, you'll pin that person so you'll be able to see them full screen. And then finally, I just want to remind you that this episode is being taped, and so if you've enjoyed yourself immensely, which I know you will, you'll be able to watch the show again on YouTube sometime later tonight, and you can share that with your friends and family also. So our schedule for the next hour is the following. We're going to first watch a video that is an overview of the work of our featured researchers today. So with me today is Linda Treiber and Jackie Jones. Then we will, after we see the video, we'll do a live interview with both Linda and Jackie, who are here, and we're going to talk to them about their research. I'm going to ask them a few questions first just to kick things off, but it's always more fun when you, the participants, get to ask questions as well. And so what we'll do after I ask a few questions is, if you want to ask a question, you're welcome to use the chats function if you have that available to you, and you can write out your question and I will ask on your behalf, or you can raise your little hand, raise your hand icon, and we will call on you to ask your question in person. So with that, I want to say thank you to Linda and Jackie for joining us today. And Heather, if you could go ahead and roll the video.
I earned my bachelor's degree in sociology, but instead of going to graduate school right away, I decided to get a nursing degree. After taking an undergraduate course in medical sociology, I realized that I needed to know more about the body, illness, and pathology in order to be successful in that field. I figured that nursing would provide that, and it did. But more than just getting a textbook education, nursing was very hands-on. I liked how holistic it was. During my time as a nurse, I enjoyed getting to know the patients, working as part of a team, and being able to solve problems. I was a practicing registered nurse in cardiac care, diabetes, and community health for about 20 years before turning my focus to academia and research in medical sociology, earning a doctorate in sociology. As a nurse, one thing that really grabbed my attention was when mistakes and errors happened in healthcare. Unfortunately, I witnessed too many of these. Greater understanding of how mistakes occur and how they can be avoided became the focus of my research at Kennesaw State. I met Dr. Jackie Jones in 2008, and she was a nursing professor at KSU. A nurse educator for 20 years, she has extensive experience as a clinician, primarily in acute and critical care. We found we had mutual research interests. Shortly thereafter, we got our first internal grant from KSU's Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning to study medication errors. Dr. Jones, now Professor Emerita of Nursing, has been the perfect research partner. Much of the national dialogue on medical errors grew out of To Err is Human, a year 2000 report by the Institute of Medicine, which is part of the National Academy of Sciences. Here, the Institute of Medicine's Committee on Quality of Healthcare in America noted that medical errors were estimated to kill about 44,000 to 98,000 people per year. This made it the 5th leading cause of death, more than AIDS, breast cancer, or motor vehicle accidents. As shocking as that was, subsequent studies have shown that the problem is much worse. In 2016, Martin McCary and Michael Daniel of Johns Hopkins estimated that medical errors kill around 300 to 400,000 per year, making it the 3rd leading cause of death. Medication errors are just one type of medical error, a subset, and a particularly common one. Since nurses administer most medications, they are most likely to be the ones involved in errors. Simply put, medication errors happen when there's a failure to follow the 5 rights: right patient, right medication, right dose, right time, and right route. While this might seem basic, just do all those things and there will be no mistakes, the situational context matters. Nurses are held responsible for mistakes, but have little input on working conditions. Their voices were not being heard. So our goal became to better understand the medication error processes from the nurse's point of view. Our initial study, When the 5 Rights Go Wrong, yielded several important findings. First, we identified many of the common causes for errors: rushing, distractions, poor staffing, and confusing or unclear medication orders. We also found that 79% of nurses in the random sample survey had made an error at some time. What was surprising were the deep emotions and visceral reactions felt by nurses who had made errors, and that these reactions were not always related to the severity of the errors, nor diminished by the passage of time. Nurses were deeply disappointed in themselves, devastated that they'd made an error. It wasn't long after our initial study that we encountered the second victim phenomenon. The term, coined by Dr. Albert Wu of Johns Hopkins University, first referred to physicians who had made a mistake and then were shamed by colleagues. They doubted their own professional abilities. That's what was happening to the nurses in our study as well. In 2015, we received additional internal funding, this time from KSU's Wellstar College of Health and Human Services, to study Bachelor of Science in Nursing graduates to determine if they were being prepared to deal with the inevitability of mistakes. We found that they were indeed making errors and that many felt inadequately prepared. What was also concerning was the wide variety of medications that had been given incorrectly, including narcotics, blood thinners, antibiotics, a variety of intravenous solutions, and insulin, many of which already have system double checks in place. Our current collaboration is with nationally known experts from the Institute for Safe Medication Practices, University of Missouri Healthcare System, and Case Western Reserve University to produce a white paper on best practices. The goal here is to synthesize 3 main strands of thought in preventing errors. First, educational prevention strategies that include awareness of the need for system-level fixes. Next is the second, victim awareness. Nurses who make errors have not only experienced guilt and shame, some have been fired and face legal charges, even murder. We understand that some errors are the result of careless or negligent actions and should result in some type of punishment. But many other errors are complex system-level problems, including shift work fatigue and new technologies. Two extreme cases come to mind. The first, incorrectly administered epidural medications to a woman in labor, resulting in the mother's death. She was charged with criminal negligence. A pediatric critical care nurse made a drug error on a critically ill infant who died. She subsequently hanged herself. How to help a colleague through making an error and second victims awareness, therefore, is the second piece. The third arm is the just culture framework. It is saying that in a complex environment, mistakes may happen, but if they do, the process will be handled fairly and in consideration of individual and system-level factors. In conclusion, we continue to conduct this research in the hopes of helping nurses and other healthcare practitioners deliver quality care. We want to prevent errors in the first place, but also offer understanding when they do occur.
Great, thank you. And I also, in addition to our guests, I want to thank Tom Boyle in our office, who's now taken over the development of these videos, and also, of course, to Joelle Walls, my StratCom person, and to Heather Hedgepeth, who's my assistant. So thank you to them. And I have already messed up the show because I was supposed to read your bios before we did the video, and I just completely did not turn my page. So I apologize. You did a good job of telling us who you are already, Linda, but I'm going to add a few more things about you in case the folks want to know. So in addition to your research on medication errors, Linda's research also includes medical sociology, work in organizations, and race, class, and gender. And what a great time to be working in those fields. She earned a Master of Science degree in nursing from The Ohio State University and a PhD in sociology from North Carolina State University. And then Jackie is with us here today, and we should all be very jealous of Jackie because she just retired this summer. And she's spending some wonderful time up in Rhode Island. And I told her when I talked to her yesterday that I was very jealous of that. So we're glad to have Jackie here today. She was a nurse educator for 20 years with extensive experience as a clinician, primarily in acute and critical care, as well as public health. Also a very timely field to be in, long-term care and home health settings. And Jackie holds a Master of Science degree in nursing from Vanderbilt University and an EDD in higher education from the University of Georgia. So I apologize for not saying that up front. So I think you are a perfect pair to kick off this series this fall for a couple of reasons. First of all, the field that you're in is so timely for what we're going through now as a nation in terms of the pandemic that we're living in, and that we hear in the news all the time about the toll that the pandemic is having on healthcare workers, and you two are intimately involved with healthcare working settings, and so I think it's just a great topic for us to talk about. Secondly, you represent interdisciplinary research, which is the overarching theme for why we do this work here at KSU, and so that's wonderful. And so I really want to focus on those two things. So you talked about beginning this research, Linda, when you met Jackie early on when you came here at KSU. And so the $1 million personal question I have is, how did you two meet? How does one meet someone in a different college to start research?
You know, it was fate. Actually, I have to thank my late husband, Mel Fine, for putting the bug in Jackie's ear. He had known her, and he suggested to her that we might want to do some research together. Is that how you remember it, Jackie?
Yes, actually, I met Mal at an AAUP meeting, and I had just been there a very short period of time, and we were just chatting. And I talked to him about, he asked me about my research. I said, well, I'm still trying to decide exactly what I want to be researching. And he talked about his wife was a nurse and recommended that I call her because she was doing some research. He thought we would be a good pair for whatever reason. And I believe it has been determined that he was pretty wise because we have had a very successful collaboration.
Great. And so, so explain to me why this particular field is of interest to you.
Well, as I said, in the video, as a nurse, I saw plenty of medication errors, and, I made a few. And so my background in nursing and then my background in work in organizations led me to believe that there was something more going on than just individual bad actors, that it was likely a system level problem. And sociology also looks at this idea of unintended rational action and how there are bad consequences to intentionally good things. So unintended consequences. And so it seemed to me like a lot of the planning that we were doing, the kind of things that we would put in place to prevent errors, actually might be causing some errors. And we were actually right about that.
So I can see on my screen, I don't know if everyone can see it, but we have our new Dean of the College of Science and Mathematics is on. It's Dr. Kojo Mensah-Wilmot, and he's going to leave pretty soon. And I'm wondering, Kojo, if you have a question that you'd like to ask our researchers since you can't stay on for the full hour. I don't mean to put you on the spot.
He's on the spot.
I just did, but no, I don't have any questions yet. I think that hopefully next time I will have my schedule such that I do not have an interference from another call. I'm sorry about this.
Okay. No worries, but I'm glad for you to talk because people can see who you are. And that's really the first step in getting to know people on campus, for them to see your face.
Okay, thank you.
All right, I'll keep going with my questions then. So you're in a field that I think is really unique, Linda. You went from nursing to doing academic research. What do you say to those students who you might meet coming through the nursing program, because I've seen this a lot, I'm in public health, so I've seen this a lot where students start in a clinical field and they quickly realize this is not for me. I still like the overall umbrella of health, but I'm not sure this clinical piece is the right thing. So what do you do, or what do you give advice to students about the field that you are in and how that complements or doesn't the field of nursing?
Well, medical sociology is very broad, and healthcare occupations are one of the biggest growing occupations. So it's not necessarily that you have to be a hands-on practitioner to do good work in this field. It's so huge that there's room for everyone. A lot of what medical sociology does is looks at data. And so there's plenty to be gathered. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a hands-on thing to make a contribution. Nurses, physicians, yes, that's who we think of when we think of the medical field, but there's so many other opportunities for people to help assist patients, to improve health literacy, and then just collecting data on what works and what doesn't in healthcare is a big piece of it. For myself, when I was a nurse, I used my sociology background really to do quality assurance work in the hospital. And that was actually collecting, data and analyzing it and then reporting my findings to the higher ups. So I think that the field is growing, it's multidisciplinary, and you would not just be limited by doing a hands-on kind of a clinical manifestation of it.
Thank you. And in the midst of COVID and our healthcare workers being stressed beyond belief, I'm sure errors are being made just because we don't know what we're necessarily dealing with. If I were the administrator of a hospital that has to deal with a hospital staff that is facing these issues, what advice from the research that you've done, what advice would you give to administrators to help our practitioners get through this?
That's a really good question. I think that what we found is a lot of errors come from rushing and distraction. And so how can there not be rushing and distraction when you're adding layers of equipment and barriers and protocols that would get in the way between the patient and nurse relationship? So one thing I would say is, slow down, take your time, focus on the patient, and listen to what that person has to say if it's possible for them to talk to you, or how can you communicate with them? Because things will get done, but if you keep your focus on understanding what's going on with the patient, you're less likely to make a mistake. Don't ignore what they say. If they ask you a question about a medication, for instance, listen to what they're saying. And instead of focusing on, oh, I've got to get this done, really quickly because it's due, wouldn't it be better to not make it an error of that kind, but rather that, have something be late rather than wrong? And I guess also care for yourself. Nurses are in a tough situation, so some self-care would be really important. What do you think about that, Jackie?
Well, I agree with everything you said. I suppose if I were talking to the administration of the hospital, I would recommend that they structure some processes to provide support, emotional and other, for nurses. This is a very difficult time. I'm Facebook friends with a lot of my previous students. They are finding it very difficult, and it's frightening as well. I mean, they're afraid of getting the disease, they're afraid of taking it home, they are oftentimes overworked, the PPEs are stretched. So there's a lot going on. So I think the administration has a responsibility perhaps to develop some processes and put them in place that provide support for the nurses. And probably the biggest thing for the nurses, I would be, like Linda said, take care of yourself. It's a hard time. Acknowledge that. And maybe to even acknowledge that, maybe in every time of tragedy, there are heroes that emerge. And right now, some of our frontline healthcare workers are the heroes of today. So maybe just to be aware of that. Yeah,
I'd like to add to that too, because when family members and friends are not allowed to be at the bedside to support patients, then the healthcare workers become that surrogate family. So they have another layer of responsibility. And, I would say, understand your own emotional needs as well as the emotional needs of the people that you're dealing with. And to go back to what Jackie said, administration needs to be aware of that as well, because they can't just, put people out there and expect them to function the way they did before. And quite frankly, there were problems before. So some kind of a support mechanism so that the nurses themselves can get some of those complex emotions off their chest would be good.
Good, thank you. So tell me about the funding that you've received to get this research launched.
Well, we were really fortunate to get a CETL grant right off the bat when we first started to do our research. And so they gave us some money to survey nurses across the state of Georgia. And we actually did a paper survey at that point, sort of a while ago. But they helped us fund that research. And we had an amazing response to it. After that, we got a second wave of funding from the Wellstar College of Health and Human Services to look at the recent graduates of the BSN program. And overall, we didn't find anything alarming. I mean, the nurses there made mistakes too, even though they'd been prepared, but it was also a little bit disconcerting to see that nurses were making mistakes, even from, our great program here. But then also that they weren't really advocating for themselves. And then I guess the final piece of funding we got also from the College of Nursing to do what we're going to be talking about here in a minute is a white paper where we brought together nursing experts from various organizations and brainstormed best practices.
So let's talk a little bit more about the white paper. In addition to this being an interdisciplinary team, the other thing I like about the two of you is that you're doing research that actually matters. and it's not just doing research for research's sake, but it's going to go out there and hopefully change lives and change culture. And so to me, that's what a white paper is. But you tell me, what are the plans? What exactly is the white paper that you're working on? And then what are the plans for dissemination into practice?
Well, the white paper is really a large document where we have three main components to it. The first part will be how can we prevent errors from happening? It's focused on nursing education, and we're working with nursing educators that are the top of their field. How can we help nursing students and nursing educators produce professionals that will be less likely to make mistakes? So that piece of the nursing education is the first part. The second part is the just culture framework. So we understand that mistakes will happen, but when they do happen, how can we deliver a sort of a fair justice? You know, you don't want people just to go on and make mistakes and say, well, there's no punishment. No, you do want things to be fair, but so many of the errors are not happening because of individual negligence or carelessness. And so a just culture framework is the second piece. And then the third piece is the second victim phenomenon. And so that's when healthcare providers make mistakes and then they're treated badly by their colleagues. They become the second victim of the error. The first victim obviously is the patient or the family members that are left if an error is severe. But the second victim is the way that health providers, and in our case nurses, feel about themselves, second guess themselves after an error. So those are the three frameworks. Jackie, would you like to add anything to that?
The only thing I would add, and this is really just because I do think this is such a relevant study, is I mean, we have a vice president from the Institute for Safe Medication Practices that participated in this study. We had the chair of CUSIN, it's a national organization that's very involved in establishing and identifying the competencies, the knowledge, skills, and attitudes that nurses should have. The ISMP is an international organization. We had one of the international expert on second victims. So I don't know about for Linda, but I think probably so though, Linda, you can say so. This was probably the most important research that I did during my tenure at KSU. And I thought a lot of our studies were very important, very relevant, but this one just had such far reaching impact. So I guess I'd say that.
Yeah, good. I believe it. Is there any different, in your research you've done, you're focusing on the nursing community, but could it be the case that there's differences in these three areas based on what type of healthcare provider you are?
Well, I would say in the hierarchy, the lower you are, the more likely you are to absorb blame, right? So, but the second victim phenomenon in particular was coined to refer to physicians. So Dr. Albert Wu, came up with that term because a physician who he'd failed to diagnose a cardiac arrhythmia. I think it was a cardiac tamponade. And so he'd failed to diagnose that correctly. And so then the patient suffered problems, and then colleagues kind of piled on and made him feel inadequate. And so he's saying, you know, anybody can make a mistake, and there's so many variables in healthcare. So I think anybody is vulnerable to it. And physicians have always had the weekly meetings where they discuss problems like a morbidity and mortality review, where they get out there and explain the problem and what went wrong. So maybe they are a little more immune because physicians protect themselves. So, and nurses are kind of in the middle. They have all this responsibility, but they don't have as much power as administrators and physicians. So I would say, kind of rolls down to them, and then they internalize a lot of that pain and guilt.
Yeah, good. All right, well, I don't want to be monopolizing all the questions, so let me open it up to the participants. again, if you want to write a question through chats or just raise your hand and we'll call on you. Everyone's always afraid to be the first one. We'll give them a second. All right, well, I'll just keep on asking questions. That's okay, I don't mind. So what's next in your research? Especially now that you've lost your partner. Are you going to look for another partner in Wellstar, and what's on the horizon for you?
Well, all of the above. I mean, I don't feel like I've totally lost my research partner Jackie, though, because we still have unfinished projects. The white paper is still yet unpublished, so it's very large. It's not necessarily what's going to be like a journal article, so we want to have it on the website for the Institute for Safe Medication Practices and maybe some other places as a resource tool. So we're just finishing that up. And I would like us to do some more research on the emotional impacts of making an error on nurses. And maybe if we're lucky, we could combine some of that with the COVID impacts. I don't know if anybody's doing research yet on the impact of COVID on medical and medication mistakes. Sadly, it's, that's an opportunity.
It absolutely is. I can tell you from our office, we're getting lots of notices of the funding, the COVID funding coming from NIH. So I think that's a great idea. There's a question from Susan.
Hi, thank you so much. This is Susan Dias, and I appreciate hearing from both of you and learning about the wonderful work that you've done. I may have come on a few minutes late. I'm not sure if you covered this, but my question is particularly related to the years in practice for the nurses that in your survey who were making or had made those medication errors. Did you find any correlation to the novice nature of who they were or not?
Yes. One of the key themes was being new. So we collected qualitative accounts of nurses, tell us about your medication error and share as much as you feel free to share. So a lot of the stories were being new stories. I didn't know this. I, made the mistake because I did this, and this. So I would say being new is one of the highest risk factors. And I think from my own personal experience as a nurse, most of the errors I made were when I was new, including some calculation errors that I look back now and think, oh, how stupid was I? So I would say that there is definitely a correlation, and that's really an opportunity as well.
Yeah, I have a follow-up, and thank you for that was certainly my suspicion. There's been a lot of work in recent years with residency programs and supporting the transition from education to practice. And I wonder if the findings of your white paper could support some of that literature in that, that this is a likely possibility. That's a question. And the second question, again, would be related to the folks that had experienced medication errors. Did you do any follow-up? Like, did they stay in nursing, or could they not take the emotional toll of being second victim and leave the profession?
Jackie, do you want to answer that one?
Sure, but kick in if I omit something.
Mm-hmm.
We did find a variety of responses to the errors. There was, as you would expect, a lot of emotional turmoil and difficulty. And again, this would be things long after the experience itself. Most, I think, I believe this was our finding, most stayed in nursing. Not all. Some did leave, which creates, almost a third victim phenomenon, if you will, because in the healthcare environment has to absorb the cost of training and all of that. But most did stay. they were just suffering, and I think it took them a while to get back, to gain any confidence back. Linda, would you say that?
I would say that. And I would also say another theme that emerged from our data was a lessons learned kind of a theme, right? So they would say, I learned that I would never, ever do this again. And I made it my personal rule not to do such and such. So it became a theme in the data as well. So they made a mistake, but then they had this kind of a hypervigilance, never to let that happen again. And I would say some thought seriously about leaving, because it does shatter your professional confidence, but most did not, even some that made a relatively serious error, although most of the errors that we found weren't very serious in a kind of an objective standard, but the feelings that were associated with the errors seemed to be sort of disproportionate. Like a small error was remembered years later. But then I can attest to that. My own smaller errors, I thought, oh, I can remember those years later myself. So I think the memory stays, a lesson is learned, and most, though, stuck with nursing.
I'm going to throw in there, having grown up in a household where my mother was a nurse, that I think there's a selection bias, because nurses are compassionate and they've got a servant's heart. And so they might be experiencing those events in a different way than somebody else who wouldn't go into the nursing profession. I'm just putting that out there. We've had a bunch of questions that have come in. I knew the floodgates would open, and here they are. So another question is, what have been the reactions from nurses or healthcare professionals in general about your research findings?
One of the proudest moments, I think, when Jackie and I first started presenting our work was when we presented it to a local audience, a Georgia Association for Nursing Education. And people came up to us after and thanked us because they heard their own voice in our research. And so I think that the response has been great. We've been invited to several large, presentations where we were with some leading experts in Topeka, Kansas, and then the institute that studies intravenous medication. So the Intravenous Nurses Society invited us to give a presentation. So the response has been great. I love that about it.
Research with relevance.
Yeah.
Here's another question. Can you talk a little bit more about the reporting of medical errors? I'm guessing it's severely underreported, but what can be done to promote its recognition and reporting?
One reason we don't have an accurate count is because when someone dies, medical error isn't what's written on their death certificate. So you had what McCary and Daniel did was kind of extrapolate and go back and try to figure out with the medical records, did an error cause this to happen rather than the stated diagnosis or cause of death on the death certificate. So it's very hard. Some have advocated for some sort of a format on a formal death certificate to say, was this a cause of untoward medical error of some kind, and then have them check that box and explain it. But to my knowledge, that's not being done. So we are probably just looking at the tip of the iceberg, really, in terms of that. And when you broaden the definition of medical error to include things like hospital-acquired infections, or, because people are frequently dying of those nosocomial infections, or other types of errors like falls or things like, we tend to think of errors as these catastrophic events that happen in surgery when they have two lungs and the cancerous lung is left in and the good lung is removed, and that has actually happened. But a lot of the errors are simpler than that and more hidden. And fewer autopsies are being done too, because those are very expensive. So I don't think we really have a very good picture of how many errors are being made.
Good. Next question. Is it possible that nurses are making mistakes because I think I'm going to know your answer to this, because they're overworked and haven't gotten enough rest?
Yeah. Wasn't that the case, Jackie, with one of the nurses that killed a patient, that they'd been working like double shifts and asked to work overtime?
Julie Theo. She's the nurse that injected an epidural medication into an IV line, and the patient did die. And she had worked a 16-hour shift, slept at the hospital to report the next day, and then at nearing the end of that shift, she did. And studies have found consistently that fatigued nurses make more mistakes. And of course, a lot of nurses are working 12-hour shifts, and it does end up being, resulting in more mistakes being made.
So do I remember correctly that they've changed the rules around residency programs and a couple of years ago to prevent residents from having to work double shifts or whatever to prevent errors? And if that's true, and I might just be making it up, but I thought I remember that, why would they do that for residents and not for other personnel working within the hospital system?
Well, I think residents were working like 24 hours. And so most nurses don't ever do that. But a double shift, it's okay. You wouldn't necessarily work 2 12 hours, but maybe you would work 1 12 and then another shift on the end of it, but not maybe like 4 hours more, 16 hours, something like that. But, it's fun. I was a nurse manager for a long time, and, you were given this horrible choice, like let the staff not have enough help and then patients suffer that way, or somebody's willing to work and for overtime because they're usually hourly wages and say, yeah, I can give you an extra 4 hours, Linda, or I can give you an extra 8 hours. And so you would say thank you and take them up on it. But then, of course, they're sort of taking their own license into their own hands if they're too tired to function. So, yeah, I think they've made some improvements on residents where they're not expected to work 24 hours, but I'm pretty sure they would still work 12 and maybe 16.
May I add something there? Simply because my son he's just finished his residency. He's doing a fellowship this year. They limited it to no more than 80 hours a week. Prior to then, we're doing 120 and more hours per week. Now, I don't know exactly what the law says, but I will tell you my son has done 36-hour shifts, and it is crazy. I think medical education, Linda, if we ever really wanted to pursue something outside nursing, medical education would be the thing to do because it is bizarre. Sorry, that's from
good. No, thanks for sharing that. That's crazy. I guess I won't complain about the hours that I put in here at KSU if that's what the alternatives are. Here's a good question. What medication error is the most common?
Ooh. Probably wrong dose, would you say? That's a really good question.
Probably the one that doesn't cause harm. Now, I don't know. Most medication errors don't cause harm, and that's part of that's the big problem with underreporting. They're not going to report it if it hasn't caused harm. And there are so many different types, calculation errors. But you're right, Linda. I would imagine dose would be, because I sort of don't even think about time, even though I know right time is one of them. But probably dose.
Mm-hmm. And to follow up on that, is there anything that a patient should be doing or could be doing to protect themselves from medication errors?
Well, ask questions. What are you giving me here? If the nurse brings you in some medications, I would definitely say, what are these? And if from the nurse's point of view, if the patient says, I've never had this one before, or I usually take this dose, or the pill that I usually take is a different color, instead of just brushing that off as well, they don't know. Listen, because they may be telling you are giving them the wrong medication or the wrong dose. But patients and families, if you're in the hospital, you need an advocate, which is another problem with COVID, because the patients don't have the family member there to say, no, wait a minute, my dad takes this or that. And, they don't really have that clarification. They don't have that extra buffer. So ask questions and whenever possible, have someone else with you, in any medical encounter.
Yes, thank you. Here's another question. You mentioned that that you were studying KSU nursing students. Were you able to narrow down medical errors made by nurses to a certain nursing program? Was there any evidence linked to a certain school?
No. Oh, in our large scale survey, we didn't ask people where they graduated from. In our KSU survey, it was completely anonymous. So we knew that they had spent some time at KSU, but we didn't have any kind of, we couldn't look back and say, oh, well, here's a big problem in nursing education. I will say that what surprised us was that we asked a question about being able to advocate for yourself. And so overall, the nursing program, they said it prepared them, although they would identify some inadequacies, but not being able to advocate for themselves in a clinical setting, that was a finding that we weren't really prepared to see. So.
And does KSU's nursing education program, Jackie, does it address that piece? Does it train our nursing students how to be advocates for themselves?
We have a few courses, and certain things are threaded throughout, but we have a leadership course, which leadership is a big part of being able to advocate for yourself. And we also have a professionalism and ethics course. So I think those two things together probably attempt to do that. I think when the new nurse goes out there, we have embedded so strongly to advocate for the patient. I mean, that's a historical competency that everyone really focuses on. Advocate for your patients, advocate for your patients. You are the voice of your patient many times, and you have to advocate for them. So I think we probably tend to emphasize that. And somewhere along the lines, as they get out there and they're new and they're uncertain, and that first year is just very difficult. I mean, it's difficult for them. So I think it would be something we could probably focus more on.
Yeah, and I would say in all of our training of college students, right? I mean, any profession you go into, you start off at the bottom of the ladder, and it's a life skill that we should be embedded in every course we teach, I think. There's a couple more questions, and they're related, and I think people really are so fascinated with your research of the students. And they're asking the questions about what are the factors other than what you already said, which is being new at your job. Are there other things that came out as significant in your research? Could it be gender, which you may not have a lot of variability there to check? Could it be race? Could it be type of nurse? So either ER nurse or pediatric, etc.
I wouldn't say any of those things. We didn't have a lot of variability, so most of our nurses in our sample, both times, were women. And the racial diversity didn't play out in any kind of a meaningful way. One thing, though, that did come to mind was the new technologies. So the idea that technologies are supposed to prevent mistakes, which is, a technological imperative. We've got this technology, we must use it. A lot of people made mistakes because they didn't know how to use it. They didn't get the full in-service training on this particular piece of equipment, and so they maybe tried to override it, find a workaround. Or some technologies, they did know how to work them and they didn't like the way they worked, so I need this medication now, so I'm just going to try to find a back door in. And so that often led to mistakes. So technologies was one thing that I wasn't really surprised by, that, just because that's sort of the way the world works. Other things, that's the technologies being new, rushing, and then there's sort of hypervigilance, never to make a mistake again. Those were significant things. Although sometimes they couldn't read the doctor's writing. Sometimes a doctor would give a verbal order and say, give the patient such and such, well, instead of, documenting in a record. And so then the person heard it wrong and went ahead and did that. And then errors happen in emergency situations like a code where everybody's kind of rushing and things are very stressful for everybody.
Brandon has a question.
Hi, Linda.
Hey, Brandon.
I was just about to ask you, because earlier on in your talk, you mentioned, new technologies that were being put into place that were actually not working or not preventing. So I was going to ask you to elaborate on that, which you just did. So my other question, since you answered that one, I'm kind of interested methodologically how you two approach your research. If you've been doing, it sounds like you've been doing a lot of survey-based research. I'm also interested in if you've done any qualitative research and kind of when you're trying to solicit information from nurses or nursing students about medical errors, how do you operationalize that? And how do you maybe get someone to discuss a medical error that maybe they never talked about before, never reported any before prior to them encountering your research?
Okay. Well, we let them define the medical error. So I think our questions in the open-ended survey were, have you ever made a medication error? And so it's broad. And then, if so, tell us about that. So we didn't say a medication error is defined as blah, 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 blah. We let them, tell us what they thought it was. We did mostly survey research with a call back for people that wanted to participate additionally, but that was also a survey. One project that we haven't talked about was when we did the medication error reduction with the brightly colored vests. So this is was done at I guess Kaiser Permanente originally did this research where a nurse would wear a brightly colored vest or sash as the signal to say to other people, don't interrupt me, because distractions are such a big part of it. And so we actually asked nurses to wear these vests and then put up their phones so that the phones wouldn't interrupt them. And so we didn't necessarily find a big error reduction, but we did find an increase in people being more aware of errors. So it's sort of that happened. A lot of people liked not having to be distracted and not having to answer their phone, but then others felt like they were so disconnected from their patient because they didn't have this line of communication. So nurses are actually very good at multitasking, and I think a lot of the literature that says it's all distractions doesn't really take into account that many people can do more than one thing at a time, and nurses especially.
Good question. All right, I'm going to take one more or shoot one more to you, and then we're going to call it a day. There's a raging storm outside that we're all going to get to drive home in. So the last question is, did the age of the nurse play a factor in medication errors? And I guess I would caveat that question to say outside of experience, separate from experience, if you were able to tease that apart.
No, we didn't. Most of the errors seem to happen early in careers, and we didn't see a correlation with age. I would like to add that, because of the funding that we got from KSU originally, our research has been cited worldwide. So when the 5 rights go wrong has been cited over 160 times. And Devastatingly Human, which was the more qualitative piece, about 70 times. And, people in Turkey, Iran, Finland, Spain, United Kingdom, Australia, Greece, these people and others have used our research. And so that's been one of these big impacts that we've been able to make with a relatively small startup. And so we're very happy about that.
That's
you can do research.
That is awesome. Thank you for that, Linda. I've got a couple hands that came up. It's 4:54. So if you can be quick, Scott Gordon, you've got the stage.
I'm very quick. It's not even a question. It's a comment. Just saying, ending on a light note, Linda and Jackie, if you have not seen the movie Knives Out, I think you would both really like it.
Thank you.
Those who've seen it know what I'm talking about.
And I have no idea what you're talking about. I've never even heard it, but that's okay. Lisa Davis, one more question.
Hi, thanks for such a great talk. You said you were interested in studying more about the emotional aspects of the nurses. Do you have any idea what methodologies you're going to use to capture emotions? Will it be the same in the survey or open-ended interview questions? How are you going to go about that? Thanks.
That's a really good question. I think some of the emotions are put forth when the person that's describing is anonymous. But then again, I think a focus group might be a good idea because people will see others and they'll feel that same shared sense of, I'm not the only one that's had this happen. So I would like to sort of branch out from surveys and actually do some focus groups. Ask for volunteers and say, let's have a dialogue about, medication errors and the emotional response that you may feel and the emotion work that you have to go through to kind of tell yourself it's going to be all right after you make an error. And anything else they'd tell us, I would love to do that.
So I'm currently doing discourse analysis on acute stroke patients and going for some emotional. So if you ever wanted to talk about that.
Excellent. If we can get the networking going right here, our job has been, we've done our job for the day.
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to end us there. So thank you to Linda and Jackie for your time. This is in the midst of you teaching and being retired, and you've got a lot of other things going on. And so I really appreciate the effort that you spent in getting this all prepared for today. We are off next week, but Research with Relevance comes back in 2 weeks, and we will be featuring Aisha Tekis, who is an assistant professor of mechanical engineering, and Tris Uchig, who's an associate professor of nuclear engineering from Southern Poly. And we're excited to hear about their research in 2 weeks. So on behalf of the Office of Research, I just want to say thank you, stay healthy, safe, have a wonderful weekend. See you in 2 weeks.
Thank you, Phaedra.
Bye-bye.
Bye.